are the definitions of political violence and mass political violence, and in what cases or under which circumstances is it called genocide?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be a part of this conversation. I'll start off with political violence and mass political violence, as you noted. So those terms don't have necessarily formal legal definitions, or at least to the extent that they do, they vary by country. But generally, when we talk about political violence, we're referring to sustained and organized collective violence between groups around, broadly speaking, political questions. So it can be, for instance, around religious identity, but it's been politicized. It can be around ethnic or racial identity, but it's been politicized, or class, or just political ideology. In general, issues of political violence tend to generate, legally speaking, concerns and a whole set of obligations and responsibilities in the context of law. So you can imagine, for instance, crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide. These all have to do with political violence in the way I've talked about it, in the sense that they're normally not used for thinking about domestic criminal violence or quotidian violence, kind of everyday violence. So political violence doesn't exclusively have to involve the state, but it almost always does involve the state, for the simple reason that the state is a major political actor. Mass political violence is anything at a large scale, and that scale can be either in terms of lethality or just in terms of scope of people affected, even if large numbers of people aren't being killed. So that can include all sorts of things like killing, tortures, disappearances, arbitrary detainment and arrest, forced expulsion, questions like that. And very often we see these things going hand in hand. And then you asked about genocide. And genocide is an interesting concept and term because there is a standing legal definition under international law as to what genocide is, though it's worth noting that many scholars, including myself, I'm an expert on genocide, so that's kind of what I work on. Many of us are somewhat critical of the definition. But let me start with a definition first, just to kind of give you a sense of what it entails. Genocide refers to the intentional destruction of groups in whole or in part. So there's several elements to that are important. One is that it's intentional violence. It is not something that happens as a consequence of some other aim or some other goal, but the intention is violence directed at groups. The second part is the group part. And under international law, what this basically means is the attacking of civilian groups, but specifically with the goal of destroying that particular group. So the definition in genocide under international law includes ethnic, racial, religious, or national groups. And this basically means that if you are a member of one of these groups and the state or a rebel group is trying to destroy that group as such, so it's not just about killings and torture and displacement, but it's about the destruction of the group as such, like trying to kill all Jews, for instance, in the Holocaust or Tutsi in Rwanda, then it's genocidal. So you can think of genocide as group-directed, group-destructive violence that is intentional. I mentioned a little bit how there's some debate and question about this among scholars, and that's largely because the Genocide Convention, which is the standing law we have today and used in the International Criminal Court, that definition is a product of political compromise and after World War II. And so it left out, for instance, people targeted for political identity, for their class, for social status, et cetera. It focused on those very specific categories of race, ethnicity, nationality, and religion. That's a product of its time.
In the same context, what do justice and reconciliation mean?
Unsurprisingly, you're not going to be surprised to know that there are a lot of definitions of reconciliation and a lot of ways of understanding it. We sometimes think of reconciliation in an abstract philosophical or ethical framework, but undoubtedly it's also a product of political debate and power relations, right? So the term reconciliation, for instance, if you use it in Argentina today, a lot of people are very skeptical of the language because they see it as a problematic assumption that people can coexist without addressing accountability. So having said that, the concept of reconciliation, the way we use it in these contexts of political violence, has a long history, but it really takes off in the 1990s through today. And when we think of reconciliation, you can think of it as kind of on a continuum. There are some people who equate reconciliation with minimal amounts of coexistence. So you and I don't fight, we don't argue, we resolve our problems through voting rather than through arms, but we don't necessarily respect each other, we don't like each other, we continue to despise each other, et cetera. That's a thin conception of reconciliation. At the far extreme, at the other end, is reconciliation as often understood coming out of theological traditions, which talks about a really fundamental care and transformation where you come to forgive the other side. So it's a much stronger formulation. My own sense is, while some of those accounts are certainly preferable and we might aspire to them, when we're talking about politics, often the most you can hope for is that people coexist, and that the people who have been most targeted, the victims and the survivors, actually get the support that they need in order to have some sense of justice and some sense of being able to move forward. So having said this, reconciliation, you can think of reconciliation as a condition which allows for morally acceptable coexistence. That's kind of the easiest way to put it. Reconciliation, the reconciliation politics, as we sometimes refer to it, has become much more intense over the past, I'd say 25, 30 years, after the transitions in Latin America and then Eastern and Central Europe. And then, of course, it continues to come up today. I did work with a human rights organization on the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And part of the debate was an argument over what reconciliation was. There are people who say reconciliation is forgetting the past and moving forward. Those are the people who tended to defend the perpetrators, unsurprisingly. Same thing in South Africa. And then others who said reconciliation is only possible with justice and holding perpetrators accountable. That tended to be victims groups and civil society. So there's a lot of debate here. But needless to say, the question of reconciliation, whether one is persuaded by it or not, becomes much more intense in the context of civil conflicts, civil war, internal dissent, internal violence, in a way that is not quite as pronounced when it's between countries, for the simple reason that between countries, people don't have to coexist, right? So we can talk about Ukraine, we can talk about some other cases if you'd like as well, but in any case, it's the kind of thing that regardless of how one feels about reconciliation, it is an unavoidable political debate. It always comes up in countries that have deep political conflicts internally.
Within this specific framework, what do war or conflict and peace mean, and how do all these terms interact?
So we tend to think of war, kind of standard way of thinking of war is that you have two armed belligerents, the state and either another state or say a rebel group, armed opponents, right? But they're coherent, they have political claims and political values and political interests and aims, and they have some kind of coherence to them. War then is about organized collective violence. Political violence, you can think of political violence as a bigger category that includes war, but it's not reducible to that. Governments commit repression against their populations all the time, and it's not a condition of war. It's just widespread repression. But what's fascinating and what's complicated is that you also have situations where traditionally we wouldn't think of them as political violence situations, but nevertheless, excluding them is really problematic. And here, of course, I'm thinking of the case of Mexico. A traditional and older way of thinking about violence in Mexico, one would say, well, the activities of the criminal organizations and the drug cartels, et cetera, these are not groups that seek political control. They seek economic resources and control for economic reasons. So it's criminal violence, not political violence. But what we know is that, in fact, the distinction between criminal and political violence is often very porous. There's a lot of gaps in it. And Mexico is a perfect example of this, but you could make the same argument about Colombia. I mean, the FARC was basically a cartel towards the end. In many parts of Central Africa, you have guerrilla groups that have an ideology or an ethnic identity, but in large part, they really are just organized criminal enterprises. So the boundaries get really a little bit confusing. And this is it's not a small or trivial point. I mean, we have to be careful about the terms we use. If we, for instance, use the language of war to address some of these questions, then we are likely to emphasize military responses and de-emphasize aspects that deal with civil society and social healing and all of these questions. So you can think of political violence as including war as a subset, whether it's international or civil, and that's basically organized combatants. You can think of the difference between political and criminal violence over whether the violence has a political dimension to it. And then thirdly, the distinction in practice is not so apparent. And again, I think Mexico is the classic, the relevant example here, not the only one, but the really important one. You asked about peace and peace building. I think that peace and peace building, much like my point about reconciliation, there are different ways of thinking of it. Some people understand peace in the sense of what we refer to as negative peace, that is an absence of direct violence, absence of killing, torture, disappearances, etc. That's a big deal. We should not be critical of that or dismissive. At the same time, peace has to be much more substantial. So if that's negative peace, you can think of what we sometimes refer to as positive peace, which is really about creating conditions for human flourishing. But that requires functioning state institutions, minimal amounts of corruption, public voice, all the conditions that are not just about individual rights, protection from violence, but creating conditions so that communities and people can flourish. That's a lot harder to do. And it also means that we need to think of peace building not only in the language of security, but also in the language of how do we ensure that the most marginalized and sidelined groups of people actually become fellow contributors to political, economic, and social development. Very hard to do, but it is doable. We know what works. There's very good research by this point, both academic and practitioner research on peace building. We know what works. It's just hard to do. And sometimes there's a lack of political will, or there are challenges around corruption, et cetera. I can talk about that if you'd like, but the point is it's not just aspirational and philosophical.
How can this latter type of peace be achieved after relevant political violence? Can you point to a case in which it has been attained?
I think that we need to think about timescales, and we need to appreciate the fact. And one of my colleagues, who's this very well-known peace builder and peace mediator, Jean-Paul Lederach, used to say that however long the history of violence has been and the sources of that violence have been, that's how long you should expect the process of peace building and reconciliation to go for. In other words, we can't assume that it's 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. You know, we have these debates. I've done work on Rwanda, has a long history of colonialism and then mass violence in the post-colonial context. And then people will say, well, you know, but the genocide ended. They had the Gacaca courts, which are these like special community courts. The violence ended almost 30 years ago. So why does this keep happening? And it's like, well, 30 years is not a long time because these legacies of violence, it's not just how they affect culture and the norms and the values, but they also affect institutions and how elites, for instance, respond to perceived threats. If there's a history of using violence to respond to a threat, you're more likely to use violence again in the future. And the example of El Salvador, I think, is a really good one. I'm glad you brought that up. I was thinking of Guatemala, but you know, it's a variation on the same thing. I think there are kind of two problems here sometimes when we think about what success is. One is a tendency to have a very narrow understanding of what the violence is in the first place. So the first thing we have to keep in mind is that the way we actually articulate the problem affects what we think can be done about it. So I'll give you a slightly different example that I think really captures the intensity of it. When Guatemala had the peace accords in 1996, which was a huge thing. I mean, obviously it was great. But one of the things you see is that there was this uptick in violence right afterwards for several years. And the violence was of two types. One was armed groups that had belonged to the military that then became criminal organizations. Unsurprisingly, they have guns, they have logistics, they trust each other, and they're used to using violence. Not surprising. These are the pandillas, right? The gangs and stuff. But then secondly, and this is really important, what you saw was a significant rise in violence, in domestic violence inside homes, particularly violence against women. The problem was that people weren't talking about that. They were saying, well, that's just everyday violence, that's civilian violence, that's quotidian, that's a different thing, but the war is over. But no, it's not over. You know, the different types of violence can reinforce one another. And there's very good anthropological work that has kind of shown that connection. So this is why we need to be very careful about how we distinguish and slice and dice our understandings of violence. El Salvador is a perfect example. I mean, Bukele is already kind of, you know, reverting to a kind of a strong arm technique, and there seems to be some support for it in the country, which is problematic. So if the first point is about how do we slice and dice our terms and our concepts, which in turn affect the policies that we believe are legitimate and should be put in effect, should be implemented. If that's the first issue, the second issue to keep in mind is that when it comes to peace building, we need to have a long horizon and we need to think about the sequencing of things. So if we were to take a case like, you know, Mexico or Colombia, but many cases around the world, one of the things we know that the research shows us is that securing a peace accord or ending bringing about negative peace, so the minimal peace, bringing that about without addressing deep structural issues, countries that do it that way have a much higher recurrence of violence in the future. The research shows it consistently. If you don't address root causes and root problems, you have a higher probability of violence again recurring. Countries that have civil wars without substantial peace accords are likely to return to civil war again in the future. So there's, you know, the idea of focusing on structural, deep problems of marginalization, poverty, inequality, corrupt institutions. This isn't just because it seems like a good idea. It actually has effects in the long term. So those are kind of the 2 points I'd say about that. You asked about a case where it may have succeeded. This is tough, right? Because countries kind of cycle in and out. Sometimes they do better than at some points than others. In some ways, some of the European cases have been a success historically. You know, we forget how important institutions like the EU have been at, for some period of time, really tamping down the likelihood of violence in a continent that, I mean, let's be honest, Europe was a really violent place. And Europeans love to talk about how the rest of the world is violent, but they exported their violence all over the place. So, you know, there has been something of a reduction of these forms of violence, and it's because there have been institutional efforts at trying to reframe these questions. Those are relatively successful cases. So you can have stability in different ways, but you really need to address those bedrock institutional questions and also issues of exclusion. I mean, exclusion drives violence without a doubt.
Adding to what you just explained, how can exclusion or the perception of being excluded be avoided in processes dealing with political violence?
It's important to understand that, you know, when it comes to policy formulation for these types of questions, there are no 100% guarantees, right? So we're talking about probabilities, there's counterfactuals, there's all these different players involved who have different amounts of power and can exercise it. And additionally, part of the challenge is that politics is what people perceive it to be. So we can have objective understandings of things, but then people perceive things differently, and there's only so much you can do about it. So having said that, you can think of this in a variety of different ways. You can think of, for instance, if you're looking at a transition out of significant political violence into something like a democracy, you have to first ask yourself, what are the objectives? Is it rule of law and democratic competition? Is it accountability for perpetrators? Is it minimal peace? Is it addressing the question of survivors and victims and what their needs are? Is it about reformulating a sense of collective identity that rejects past exclusive forms? All of those things are desirable, but sometimes they are in tension with one another. Actually, Latin America has a really good and interesting, instructive history in this, which is the classic example of, do you want peace with amnesty, so negative peace, or do you want accountability, right? Argentina, Brazil to various extents, Uruguay, but certainly Chile, they all struggled with these questions. These are the classic transitional justice questions. So the different values and norms can be in tension with one another. And then sometimes the question becomes, how do you sequence it so at least you don't create too much instability in the short term? But what are the things that work? Part of it is undoubtedly you need political leaders who are willing to do this. That's just a fact, unfortunately, because it's not like they always exist. It's good to have a Nelson Mandela, right? But it's not just Nelson Mandela. I mean, I think sometimes we overstate that. You also need to create institutions where different groups feel like they have the possibility of participating and even sometimes winning politically. That's why you need to have free and open elections. But there also have to be measures and institutional parameters that ensure accountability. And that means, for instance, in a lot of countries, it involves restructuring the security apparatus, the armed forces, the national police, but also the judiciary, which is frankly part of it, and also the prison system. All of these things are integral to state power. And if they remain enclaves of impunity and corruption, then essentially you can see the return of violence in different guises. So significant anti-corruption efforts are important. And then there are hard questions in countries, especially that have deep economic inequality, that has been a driver. There are very hard questions of how do you redistribute economic wealth and ensure conditions for human flourishing for other people who have been marginalized. South Africa is a classic example, right? Economic power is still maintained in the hands of whites, the white minority, even though there's a black middle class now, so a small one. You're not going to have significant reconciliation and justice if people continue to be marginalized because of the legacies of the past. So they are very difficult questions. The so-called international community can be very helpful here. I say so-called because I don't actually believe there is an international community, but that's because I spend too much time working on conflict and power. So, but it can have an important role in helping these transitions move along. At the same time, there is a tendency for the international community to stop paying attention after 2 to 3 years. So this is more sustained attention has to be given. When we say civil society, we have to be careful because civil society can be an analytical category, which just means people who are not political parties, corporations, or government, but can also be a normative category. That is something that we esteem. And there's a tendency sometimes to collapse the two. What I mean by that is not all civil society groups are good, right? Some of them are really exclusivist for all sorts of reasons. Having said that, civil society actors can be extremely important in these moments of transition and trying to deepen and consolidate democracy, because it is in civil society that the really hard and uncomfortable and ugly questions get asked. Political elites, especially government elites, have an interest in trying to limit as much of that as possible for issues of governance and also just for staying in power. Political elites love amnesties, right? So it's like, okay, well, you stop doing that, I'll stop doing this, let's move ahead. Reconciliation has happened, we move forward. It's in civil society that you see continued demands asking questions about, well, what is the extent of responsibility? What is the extent of culpability? What does it mean to be a Colombian or Rwandan or South African, et cetera? It's where those really hard questions get articulated. And that can include social movements, broad justice social movements. It can include more technical human rights organizations and lawyers groups. We know, for instance, that research consistently shows that if you have a vibrant civil society movement that includes women's organizations and that you have women leaders, that's highly correlated with better consolidated peace building. It's not because women are somehow more peaceful than men. It's not a biological argument. It's just an argument that, frankly, you need to include more people. And that often, because of the way cultures operate, and frankly, all cultures are misogynistic, right, and patriarchal, because that's the case, people who have experiences of exclusion and injustice of injustice tend to have much more nuanced understandings of what's needed. So the inclusion of women's groups is crucial in these types of efforts, and really being leaders, not just a voice, but actually being leaders and having agency. So all of these things are important. Now, everything I've said, you may think to yourself, or your listeners may think to themselves, well, that's a lot. That sounds really hard. It is hard, but the alternative is a less perfect democracy and even a greater likelihood of a return to violence in one guise or another. So it is very difficult. Even my own country, the United States, is still dealing with the legacies of the Civil War. I mean, you've seen this with the George Floyd demonstrations and the Trump administration's crazy racist responses to it, and the rise of a very hard racist right in the United States. It's always been there, but it's worse now. But in any case, these things take a really long period of time. So the struggle is a long one, but things can improve.